Chapter 12 picks up with Amir and Soraya continuing to talk at the flea market, which causes some rumors to start. And then Soraya tells Amir that she wants to be a teacher, but her father doesn't want her to be. Baba eventually comes down with a cold, and even though he claims he's fine, Amir sees him coughing up blood, so they go see a doctor. And they learn that Baba has a spot on his lungs. Baba is unhappy with the first doctor because he is a Russian, and he's angry about the Russians invading Afghanistan, and so he makes Amir find him a new doctor where he learns that he has cancer. Baba wants this to be kept a secret, but as the year goes on, Baba gets increasingly worse, and they find that the cancer has spread to his brain. The Tahiris visit Baba at the hospital, and Amir asks Baba to formally ask for Soraya's hand in marriage for him, which is a custom in Afghanistan. And Amir and Soraya become engaged, and she tells him about her scandal of her moving in with her boyfriend and the double standard that exists between men and women. And Amir still wants to marry her anyway because he has his own demons.
The only part I thought was interesting. Well, I don't know. I guess I just thought it was interesting. Like he didn't want to be treated by the doctor who was Russian. Even though they're not in Afghanistan anymore. But still, he was still he didn't want to be treated by a Russian doctor.
So do we want to just talk about when Soraya was telling him about her past?
Sure.
So Soraya wants to tell Amir about her past, and so she says, "When we lived in Virginia, I ran away with an Afghan man. He was 18 at the time, rebellious, stupid, and he was into drugs. We lived together for almost a month. All the Afghans in Virginia were talking about it. Paydar eventually found us. He showed up at the door and made me come home. I was hysterical, yelling, screaming, saying I hated him. Anyway, I came home and, I heard her put the phone down below her nose. Sorry, she came back on, sounding hoarse. When I came home, I saw my mother had a stroke. The right side of her face was paralyzed, and I felt so guilty. She didn't deserve that. Paydar moved us to California shortly after. How are you and your father now, I said. We've always had our differences. We still do, but I'm grateful he came for me that day. I really believe he saved me. She paused. So does what I told you bother you? A little, I said. I owed her the truth on this one. I couldn't lie to her and say that my pride, my iftikhar, wasn't stung at all, that she had been with a man, whereas I had never taken a woman to bed. It did bother me a bit, but I had pondered this quite a lot in the weeks before I asked Baba to go to Katsugari. And in the end, the question that always came back to me was, how could I, of all people, chastise someone for their past?
I don't know, I just thought this part was really neat because there was just a lot within this dialogue, and you kind of you develop an understanding for both the characters, I think, and I thought it was cool with the structure of it too, because when you were reading that, it's when hysterical, he said I was hysterical, and then it says yelling, and then that's its own, it stands on its own, and then he says screaming, that's on its own. So I just think that kind of emphasizes that, and it just shows how Soraya was willing to open up with Hassan and everything, and I thought that was very neat.
I just think it's interesting that he's willing to accept her past and everything, but he's not willing to give up his past to her and see if she'll do the same for him. He's still holding on to his past.
And the rhetorical question at the end of that quote, how could I, of all people, chastise someone for their past? And so like you said, he's still holding on to his past, but he still will not tell anyone. Even after she revealed it to him, he will not tell them. And that's kind of still him holding on to that shame and how he treated Hassan so horribly after everything that Hassan did for him.
Or how could he chastise someone else for their past, but he continually chastises himself for his past. So.
And I also thought throughout, it always just seems like it comes back to Hassan. No matter what, I feel somehow Amir always thinks of him, and in just everyday life, he's just something reminds him of Hassan, and I just think that's really neat because throughout the book I feel it's very repetitive with him talking about Hassan, but it's always something different, and so I just think that repetition just kind of like him being brought up
Yeah.
more and more throughout the chapters.
And
is
like
really
it says,
strong.
and it says, in the end, the question that I always come back to, that the question that always came back to me was this: how could I, of all people, chastise someone for their past? So just again, how Hassan's memory, his relationship with Hassan, and everything they went through together has been carried with him like throughout his life. It's something that he thinks about, that's affected him, even though Hassan's no longer with him.
Yeah, and like I feel like that one question could also like lead to even more, because I feel like when the readers are like first reading it, we kind of wonder like, well, will he ever like tell her about it? And if he like would tell her, like would she think differently of him? And do you think that's the reason why he didn't tell her? Because like he didn't want her to like not like end up like liking him like he liked her. So
Yeah.
Something like just to kind of analyze how like Soraya's kind of personality is when she's saying like I was 18 at the time, and then there's ellipses rebellious, ellipses stupid, and ellipses, and she keeps like pausing to show her hesitation while she's telling him, because she knows that this could kind of jeopardize their engagement. Like she knows the tradition, like he might say I can't be with you because you've already been with another man, but she still trusts him enough to say it anyway, and she wants to tell him about her so that like they don't have any secrets in their marriage, even though Amir has a really big one that he won't tell her.
And I think it's kind of ironic to me when like she asks, so does what I told you bother you? And he says a little. I said I owed her the truth on this one. I just think that's funny because he says he owes her the truth, but yet here he is still like keeping all this stuff from her, like about everything with his son. He thinks saying is that it does bother him, and it's him being like a little bit truthful. I think he's not owning up to everything.
Chapter 13 starts with Amir and Baba at the Tahir's house for lofts, which is a ceremony for giving word. There are many guests that attend, but Sarai is not present because that's tradition. While there, Baba asks the general to accept Amir as his son-in-law, and he does, and they all just celebrate and have a really good time. Sarai and Amir don't have the typical engagement period because Baba's health is declining, so they want to get married pretty soon. Baba spends almost his whole life savings on this wedding, and when Sarai and Amir do have their wedding ceremony, Amir starts to think of Hassan, and he wonders if he got married, and if so, whose face was under that veil. Shortly after they get married, Sarai and Amir move in with Baba because he's very sick. Amir comes home one day, and he finds Sarai reading Baba's stories that Amir had written, and eventually Baba is able to support Amir's writing. And about a month later, after the wedding, Baba dies in his sleep. And then Sarai begins to talk to Amir about everything that happened in Virginia. And at her uncle's wedding, 2 women call Sarai unvirtuous because of what happened. And Sarai tells Amir about Virginia and how the general came with a gun in hand. And there are 2 bullets that were in that chamber. One was for himself and one was for Sarai's boyfriend if Sarai did not obey and come with him. And she ended up obeying, and the general also had her cut her hair. Sarai and Amir move into an apartment. Amir enrolls at San Jose State, and he declares English as his major. Sarai enrolls a year later and declares education. Her father isn't happy with this choice of hers, but she continues to go through with the decision. Amir finishes his first novel. This is a father-son story that takes place in Kabul, and within a short period of time, Amir is a published novelist. While Amir becomes a successful writer, the Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan, the civil war breaks out in Afghanistan, and the Cold War ends, and lots of other problems occur. Amir and Saraya try to have a kid, but they are not successful. They see a doctor, and Amir passes the test, but Saraya does not. She has something called unexplained infertility. They tell the Tahirs about this, and the general is not They tell the Tahirs about the whole pregnancy, and they say how adoption was an option. And the general is not very fond of this idea because he can't get past the idea that this kid would not be blood related. And this wasn't very hard for Amir and Saraya to hear, only because they didn't want to adopt either. And then the chapter ends with Amir and Saraya buying a house in Bernal Heights, which is almost an hour away from the Tahirs.
Something that I keep noticing, but I keep forgetting to bring up, is when Amir's talking about his anything about Afghanistan, he's saying the words, and then he'll say an Arabic word, and then he'll explain what it means, and it's just showing his heritage and how, I don't know. I just think it's weird that, like, the whole book's in English, but, like, he'll choose certain words. And sometimes he'll say an Arabic word and not explain what it means, but you can kind of guess. But then sometimes he'll explain what it means. And I think it just, like, kind of draws attention to what he's saying about, and, like, especially in this chapter, when they're talking about all, like, the traditions and stuff, there's a lot more.
Yeah.
Because I don't know.
Maybe it's like there's probably multiple like uses, like the reasons why. Maybe one is just to remind the reader that this isn't going on like primarily in America, that this is from an Afghani person's point of view. I don't know.
Something like in chapter 13 I really liked. It was the quote. It's like a little section. It says, listening to them, I realized how much of who I was, what I was, had been defined by Baba and the marks he had left on people's lives. My whole life I had been Baba's son. Now he was gone. Baba couldn't show me the way anymore. I'd have to find it on my own. The thought of it terrified me. And I just really liked that because it was kind of showing how like Amir has to just like move past what has happened, even though it's so hard. And like he's starting to realize that like how important Baba was in his life, even though sometimes he didn't feel like Baba loved him completely. It kind of shows that he did, and like how much he counted on him. And I like marked that this like should pathos because it shows the bond that Amir and Baba had between each other. And it was like really sad to see that Amir had to face this all on his own, and he didn't have that fatherly figure. He's in America. He has no family here. The only person he really has is Soraya and her family. So
yeah.
I also found it interesting that like the one day when Amir came home, he found Soraya reading to Baba, and it was like one of the books he'd he'd written, and Baba said, I put her up to it, I hope you don't mind. So he was like having Soraya read Amir's book to him, and he would never read his books before.
Yeah.
no, I thought that was really weird too.
Like it made me like, oh, but like then at the same time, like what changed?
I know, like why all of a sudden is he wanting to listen to his stories?
Maybe like, I don't know. Was this after he had already published something? I think it might have been.
Oh, that's a good point.
That might be why. Maybe
Because when he was a kid, he was like, this is stupid, he's
Yeah.
going to make money out of this. But now that he has,
it's like a recognized author. Like
he's probably, because his father's
Here, I
a
have
rich Afghanistan man. So that's kind of showing the social class of it all.
yeah.
I have it as like Amir, like in my notes for that chapter, I had that he comes home one day and he finds Soraya reading, but then like later, I have, that's first, and then I had that within a short period of time, Amir is a published novelist. That was even before he was published, that he was doing that. So that's kind of why I thought it was like interesting, because it was like what made him.
Maybe because like at that point Baba was like sick, and I don't know, maybe he, I'm trying to put it into words, but like he knew he wasn't going to live much longer. Maybe he wanted to like show his support for Amir, and like at this point there was no use for him to like try and say like, you can't make a career out of this is stupid, la la la.
Yeah.
You know, maybe he just felt like,
There's also like the kind of like once they get to America, like Baba and Amir like get along a lot better. And I think it's just kind of a new culture there. Like they have to they need each other.
yeah,
to
they're
survive.
both figuring it out on their together.
I think their relationship is stronger once they come to America.
Because they're on like equal footing now. They're both in a new foreign place. Like Bob was not this like recognized like person in America that he was in Afghanistan.
And then in chapter 14, this lets the reader know that it is now June 2001, and it begins with Amir moments after receiving a phone call from Rahim Khan, who is dying. He asks Amir to come back to Afghanistan. Amir tries to walk it off, but he sees a pair of red kites, and he knows that he has to go back. And he's still struggling to decide if he should go or not, and he has a dream of Hassan, and he knows that he really does have to go. And the chapter ends with him boarding his flight to Afghanistan. It says, I drove to Golden Gate Park and walked along Speckles Lake on the northern edge of the park. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon. The sun sparkled on the water, where dozens of miniature boats sailed, propelled by a crisp San Francisco breeze. I sat on a park bench, watched a man toss a football to his son, telling him not to sidearm the ball, to throw over the shoulder. I glanced up and saw a pair of kites, red with long blue tails. They floated high above the trees on the west end of the park over the windmills. So just like him just like describing, because the setting is so different from the settings that he's described in the past, like the desert, Afghanistan. And he also makes a note of describing like the father and the son like tossing football, because his father never would have gone out with him and tossed football with him. Well, he probably would have, but like his father knew he wasn't very athletic, so he wouldn't. They just didn't have that kind of relationship. And then he sees the kite, and that just once again reminds him of Hassan.
And I feel like in a way that could, well, like we already know what happens, but like when we were reading this at first, maybe we could have thought it as like foreshadowing, like is that gonna, like him traveling to Pakistan, like if that reminds him of Hassan, like will he be seeing Hassan there? Like it could kind of be foreshadowing to that and everything, but we realized that wasn't the case. But at that point in time,
I think the description is almost like kind of like, it just seemed kind of like to like relate back to like his childhood. Like I don't know, it had like a childish kind of, not childish, but like nostalgic tone to it.
So in chapter 15, Amir reaches Peshawar where Rahim Khan lives, and he takes a cab to Rahim's house, and they reach the neighborhood which Rahim lives in, which is known as Afghan Town. And there Amir sees sturdy children selling cigarettes, carpet shops, kebab vendors, and it all kind of reminds him of his time in his childhood in Afghanistan. And then Amir reflects on the last time he saw Rahim, which was 20 years earlier in 1981, and it was the last time he saw him was the night that him and Baba left Kabul. And that night they had gone to see Rahim, and Baba cried, having to tell Rahim that they had to leave Afghanistan. And once they left, Baba and Rahim kept in touch, but Amir hadn't spoken with him since just after Baba's death, so they haven't talked in a long time. And so Amir arrives at Rahim's apartment, and he answers the door, and as soon as he opens the door, Amir notices how thin and sick, and his eyes are sunken into his head, Rahim looks extremely ill. And so he invites him inside, they have tea, and they talk for a little bit. Amir tells Rahim how he's now married to Soraya, who was general to Harry's daughter, and Rahim remembers him. And then Amir talks about Baba, and Amir also talks about his life as a novelist. And obviously Rahim's really proud of Amir for becoming a writer, because he always encouraged him. And then Amir and Rahim start to talk about Afghanistan and how the Taliban's taken over, and just the kind of environment that is now in Afghanistan. So Rahim tells Amir the story of how he got a scar over his eye. So when Rahim was at a soccer game, a man next to him was cheering really loudly, and the guard on patrol heard the noise and walked over and thought it was Rahim who was doing the cheering, and so the guard hit him with the butt of his rifle. So Amir's just learning how dangerous it is essentially to live in Afghanistan right now. And later on in their conversation, Amir learns that Rahim had been living in Baba's house in Kabul since 1981, after Amir and Baba left. He took care of the place, and because he thought Baba and Amir would eventually be able to return. However, Kabul became extremely dangerous. There was a lot of fighting between factions, people trying to control the city. It just got progressively worse. Homes were being destroyed, civilians were being killed. And Rahim admits when the Taliban first took over, him and many other people were very joyous. They were very happy. They just wanted they thought that this was going to be, something to change for the better, but it obviously wasn't. And so, during their conversation, Rahim coughs into a napkin, and it's blood. And Amir asks him, how he's doing, and Rahim essentially says that he's dying, and he doesn't expect to live through the summer. And Rahim asked Amir because Raheem asked Amir to come because he wanted to see him, but also because he wanted something else. And he says that in the years he lived in Baba's house, he wasn't alone. He tells Amir that Hassan was with him. And before Raheem asks Amir for a favor that he had mentioned previously, he decides to tell him about Hassan and his time with Hassan in Baba's house after they fled Kabul.
I mean, the first thing that I noticed, I really liked the description, like, of when he first had seen Raheem Khan, because it had been a really long time. And he said on page 197, then a thing made of skin and bones pretending to be Raheem Khan opened the door. I just thought that was a really powerful description.
Mm-hmm. That's like so cool. I don't know.
I like how I'm saying like pretending to be Raheem Khan. I really
like
the
that
word choice. The
just
word choice, yes.
so
And it's like not,
exquisite.
it is him, but it's really not. It doesn't look like him. He hasn't seen him in a while. It's just like this person he can't even recognize.
Mm.
So
I like how he keeps like after he gets in, he's like, we sat on a wispy mattress set along the wall across the window overlooking the noisy street below, and it's just like it's showing how much Afghanistan has changed and how much Raheem Khan has changed. Like, he's sick, he's in like probably not the best area, he doesn't have enough money, his mattress is all wispy, and the street's really noisy, and that's a lot different from the passage we just read of him in the park, like calm and relaxed on the park bench.
So while I think the story is obviously primarily focused on like Amir and Hassan's like relationship over time, and I wonder, I just am curious to think of like when he's talking to Raheem, like why the author chose to like include so much information about like how Afghanistan's changed and like how the Taliban has like influenced like life there and stuff. Like obviously it relates to Amir and Hassan and Raheem and everyone because that's where they're from. But now since we've transitioned to like life in America, like why do you think the author like chose to incorporate so much information on that?
Well, I had a false sense of like what had happened because I didn't know the Russians were involved at any point in time. And I just found it interesting that like they were excited about the Taliban at first. Like they were absolutely thrilled by the fact that they were taking out the Russians. I just found that really interesting. Of course, they realized quickly like, okay, Taliban's not too grand.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that they even liked the Taliban at one point in time.
Something that I was noticing like when I was reading was like people it kind of felt like the author was kind of trying to like show that like everyone in the Middle East isn't what we see on TV.
Yeah.
Like I kept getting the impression like his like I at one point like someone said because the Taliban were like hurting people and someone was like and they call themselves Muslims and like I feel like in the media now like Muslims are always like terrorists but like they're calling themselves Muslims, but they're not living out what we really believe. Like they're a small percentage, and I felt like it was kind of the author talking to the reader, like everyone in the Middle East doesn't want this.
Yeah.
Everyone in the Middle East isn't like this.
Yeah. And like at the end of 15, this one quote we could talk about. I just really like when they start to talk about Hassan. The quote is, "Hassan, I said, when was the last time I had spoken his name? Those thorny old barbs of guilt bore into me once more, as if speaking his name had broken a spell, set them free to torment me anew. Suddenly the air in Raheem Khan's little flat was too thick, too hot, too rich with the smell of the street."
I just think I guess like you reading that it paints like a powerful image in the reader's mind because they just kind of are able to, I don't know, you kind of just envision
Thorny
like
old barbs of
yeah.
guilt. Like obviously guilt isn't tangible, but the author makes it almost feel tangible.
Yeah, it makes you feel like you were like feeling the same emotions
like
that
you
Amir
can,
was.
Yeah.
Okay, so with chapter 16, it's all about Raheem telling his story about how he went to go get Hassan. So he basically was lonely, and he decided that he was just going to go to Hazarajat, where he knew where Hassan was, and he invited him and his pregnant wife to come back to Baba's house, and they decided to come back, even though originally they didn't think they were going to do it. And when they did return, they actually stayed in the servant's hut, even though they could stay in like the guest bedrooms, and they cleaned the entire house and everything. And they like rebuilt different parts of the house that had fallen apart. And Hassan's wife gives birth to a stillborn daughter, and then she eventually becomes pregnant again. And during that time of her pregnancy, Hassan's mother returns, and she becomes a huge part of their family. She even delivers Hassan's son that his wife has, and his name is Sarab. And eventually the grandmother passes, and it's hard on everyone. Well, Hassan's mother, it's hard on everyone. And life with Hassan and Sarab and Hassan's wife was good, especially when the Taliban kick out the Russians. But then eventually they realize the Taliban isn't so great, as they start to ban things and then eventually begin to massacre the Hazaras.
So then in chapter 16, the really interesting thing about that was that chapter was in the point of view of Rahim Khan, and that's the only chapter out of the whole book that is not Amir talking. So that was really important, I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it was kind of cool to see how much has changed, and how like Amir wasn't even aware of all that had changed in his own, like from where he like grew up, you know what I mean? Like he has just like he was learning this all
like such a big part of what was once and still is a big part of his life changed without him even knowing it, you know, really.
Yeah.
I feel like one of the reasons why they like changed the point of view to Rahim Khan for this chapter was because when it's like, if it was Amir saying what Rahim Khan said, he would say like Rahim Khan would say a sentence, then be like, said Rahim Khan, and it would just like interrupt the flow, and it just kind of made this, because this chapter is like incredibly important about what happened to Hassan, to Amir, and so it just makes everything just so clear, and there's no interruptions, and you just know exactly what happened.
Yeah, I think that they chose, the author chose to have like Rahim obviously say this like extremely crucial part in the story, because, you know, throughout the whole novel, all of Amir's childhood, he describes Rahim as this, like, very respectable, like, person who's always respected Amir, and they had this great relationship, and, like, we think of Rahim as a reliable character, so I think to come from Rahim, who we already, like, trust, is much better than coming from Amir, someone who we don't really, like, at this point, we still kind of feel kind of, you know, he's not the most reliable, like, narrator at this point.
I think it also emphasizes the fact that, like, Amir wasn't there,
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't with Hassan. This was all had to be told by someone else because the two had split and they weren't with each other anymore.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 17, it returns back to the dialogue between Rahim and Hassan, and Amir asks if Hassan is still at the house, and Rahim pulls out letters that Hassan had actually written Amir. He had learned how to write in English and everything, and he pulled that out, and there's even a picture of him and his son Sarab. And in these letters, he speaks of like the terror of the Taliban and his hope for peace. He talks of his son, how proud he is of him. He's learning English and everything. And then he wishes for Amir's return. And if he does return, he'll find Hassan, our old faithful friend there. And then Rahim then says that Hassan and his wife were pulled out into the street by the Taliban and they were shot. And then Rahim then asks that Amir would go get Sarab, that's in an orphanage in Kabul, if he might be able to bring him back to Rahim. And Amir's all like, I can't do that. I have a life in America. How could I possibly go back and do that? And then Rahim drops the biggest plot twist of all. Hassan is actually Baba's son because Ali could not have children, and essentially Hassan is Amir's brother.
So like Hassan made a point, he was talking about how if he fights back, he would be killed. So like when
Is this in the letter that he wrote?
yeah, this was in the letter on 216 when his wife, when she like was hurt by the people in the market or whatever, he didn't fight back because he couldn't afford to be hurt and like his family to lose somebody. But then I thought it was interesting that like later on he was like refusing to get out of the house, knowing that like I'm sure he like knew that if he didn't, like he could experience the consequences of his actions, which he did. He ended up dying. So I just thought that like that was interesting that he went from like not standing up at all to standing up and like dying and like not being there for his son, which he said he would never want to do. So to see that transition was really interesting.
Something like in the letter itself that he wrote, he still called Amir, even in the letter, he still called him Amir Aga, which is like the sign of like respect. And he knows that Amir knew what happened, and he still respects him. He still thinks of himself as less than, and it just really goes towards the pathos, because you just see how Hassan really sees himself and how their relationship has always been affected by the social class.
Yeah, and then it's also interesting, like in one of his letters, he was starting to talk about like dreaming, like what he dreams for Afghanistan and just everything. So he says like, I dream that Rahim Khan Sahib will be well. I dream that my son will grow up and be a good person, a free person, an important person. I dream that. Like he just keeps repeating that. But so I thought that was interesting that the author included that right there. But then one page over, it talks about how he ended up dying. So like he had all of these dreams, but then they were like cut short. So I think that's really interesting to see how that can happen. He was able to like have that happen in such a short period of time, but it like was really effective with how he did it.
Something I thought was really, really sad was when Rahim Khan was telling him like Amir was like, so how is Hassan now? And then Rahim Khan like told him he was like, they told Hassan they would be moving into a supposedly keep it safe until I return. Hassan protested again, so they took him to the street, and then Amir was like, no. And it ordered him to kneel. No, God, no. And shot him in the back of the head. No. Farzana came screaming and attacked them. No. Shot her too. Self-defense, they claimed later. But all I could manage was to whisper no, no, no over and over again.
That was really powerful.
What I found interesting was like he's put out into the street again. He's out in the street. Hassan is.
Oh, parallelism.
And this time, Amir is saying no. He's saying no.
Oh, yeah.
Like that. He's saying something. Like wanting to stop it, but he couldn't again.
Wow. Yeah, that really
just blew my mind.
Yeah. And
just realized that.
That's a really good point. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about that is just like all of us when we're sitting here and we're reading it, like we're like all really sad about that. So I think that the author was able to really develop these characters because we literally feel the emotions that like the characters in the story are feeling. So I think that makes this story even more effective.
Yeah.